You recently published a book called Deepening Local Democracy in Latin America, Participation, Decentralization, and the Left. Let's talk about it.
Well, it's a book about how the rise of the left in Latin America really started more in the late 1980s and early 1990s at the local level. So before you had the rise of national leaders like Lula in Brazil or Chavez in Venezuela or Morales in Bolivia and Correa in Ecuador and all the rest of them. Before all that, you had a spread of leftist parties winning local elections, especially in capital cities. And in many of these cities, they were trying to establish new mechanisms of citizen participation at the local level and trying to deepen democracy. In the past, the left had often talked about democracy as a bourgeois facade, and it wasn't real. So in this case, after the dictatorships of the 1970s especially, the left sort of reevaluated democracy and began talking about deepening democracy and making democracy more empowering and more about popular sovereignty than it had been in the past when poverty and inequality had continued under democratic regimes.
All right, and you mentioned Chavez. He was a big part of this pink tide, the turn toward the left in Latin America. And he was recently just reelected to a third term in Venezuela this past Sunday. What is your view of how democracy played out in the Venezuelan elections?
Well, they had the largest turnout they've had in decades. It was over 80% turnout, and Jimmy Carter and his organization called the Venezuelan electoral system the fairest in the world. And there's a lot of talk about how the Chavez administration has state resources at its advantage and used those in the campaign, and that's true, and that's likely to exist in most countries where you have the incumbent running. And the difference in Venezuela is that the incumbent can keep on running every 6 years after a change in the Constitution, a constitutional amendment a few years ago. So it was a positive election. I mean, in the sense that more people were voting. It would have been nice to see debates between the candidates. We've just been having some debates here in the United States. It's always nice to see the candidates lined up next to each other. But in this case, Chavez refused to debate with Capriles. It would have been nice to see a little bit more of that. But it was a relatively free election. And the question about the state resources is something that could be questioned.
Okay. And you talked about so Chavez uses some national means to kind of boost his elections. And one of the things is that a lot of people in Venezuela have kind of charged him with on the other side on the opposition is using the poor as kind of as an election tool, as using the public infrastructure and improvements to it, a strong buildup to it right before elections as one of those tools that he uses to kind of gain more popular support. What do you like? How does he do that, and what do you think that effect has? What do you think the overall effect has? I mean, obviously he won the election, but do you think that's necessarily a good thing for them, or do you think that it's in the long run it actually kind of hurts that economic group?
Well, you have to look at what happened in Venezuela from the period before Chavez was elected, from essentially 1980 to about 1998. The Venezuelan economy was falling. The economy used to be strong in the 1970s with the rise of oil prices, and the nationalization of the oil industry turned a lot of those oil resources over to the state. But then in the 1980s, oil prices fell, Venezuela's economy crashed, and poverty and inequality soared in Venezuela from the 1980s and 1990s. Since Chavez was elected, in the initial period, there was another crash in 2000, 2001, and then the 2002 coup when the Venezuelan economy really fell dramatically, as there was an oil strike led by the opposition that damaged the oil industry and led to billions of dollars in losses to Venezuela. So there's a big crisis. Since then, since 2003, 2004, Venezuela's economy has done rather well, and the poor have benefited from it, and from Chavez's social programs, especially the rise of healthcare spending, education spending, pensions, the big expansion of the pension system. But what's the more troubling aspects are the immediate populist measures that go in a few months before the election, like there's a program called Mi Cocina Bien Equipada, which means my well-equipped kitchen. And you get cheaper washing machines and dishwashing machines and things like that for these are imported from China at low prices and then subsidized for lower income people to buy. And it's a money loser for the Venezuelan state. But it helps people who want to have these things, right? So those programs are less beneficial in the long run. But in general, the poverty has dropped in Venezuela dramatically. Inequality is at the lowest level in Latin America. It's lower than anywhere else in Latin America, and I think that's a good thing.
And you talked about one of the subsidies, and a lot of the programs are subsidized through the Venezuelan oil and the nationalization, because that's one of the things that Chavez did. Do you think that has a future of drying up like that? Like, obviously, Venezuela's oil reserves are limited, but do you think that, aside from it being physically limited, do you think that the time that Venezuela can actually rely on oil is do you think that itself is limited?
It's not good for the economy to be relying on a single commodity, and that's true for many economies. On the other hand, Venezuela actually has the world's largest oil reserves, 500 billion gallons of oil, right? And they produce about 1 billion gallons a year. So they've got at least 500 more years to go. So it's not, it is finite, but it's not. In Venezuela's case, the end point is further out.
There have been some reports that oil production levels have sort of plateaued in the last year or so because of infrastructure or whatever other reasons. Do you think Chavez will aim to now boost those production levels? And then also, speaking of the economy, there are fairly high inflation levels, and there might be potential devaluation of their currency. What can or will Chavez do for the economy now?
With regard to the currency, I'm thinking that it will be devalued within the next year, definitely. With regard to inflation levels, they're around 20%. They're lower than they used to be in the 1990s when they were about 60%. So Venezuela's been living with relatively high inflation, 20-30% for the past several years. I don't think that will change. What was the rest of the question?
Their oil production levels have kind of plateaued.
Yeah, they have plateaued. They've been stagnant at about $1 billion gallons of oil a year. I don't think they'll try to step up production especially much. I mean, they've been saying that they were going to have it higher for a while, but there hasn't been a huge push for that. They've been signing new agreements with international oil companies to develop the Orinoco oil belt. But we've heard this before, and the oil levels haven't come up. So the production levels haven't come up much. I'm thinking it's probably going to stay more or less flat. Yeah.
Okay, and now turning back to the election, this was the closest race in the history of Chavez running for president. He also had a lot to deal with in the past year with his cancer, while Capriles was running all around the country and doing rallies, campaigning. Do you think Chavez ever felt threatened that he wouldn't be able to win?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about that, especially early on, and Chavez was reacting to Capriles's energy and his campaign by insulting him, calling him mahunche, which means sort of poor quality. He insulted him in worse ways as well, but the big one was mahunche, and so a lot of people interpreted that as Chavez feeling very threatened by this campaign, and that seems pretty reasonable. The funny thing is that the opposition then took the mahunche label and said, somos mahunche, we are mahunche, and there's a famous band in Venezuela, Los Amigos Invisibles, the Invisible Friends, and they've had a over a decade-long career now, and they had a song called Mahunche, and they told Chavez that he couldn't use it in his campaigns, or he shouldn't use it in his campaigns. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting.
And how? So this was the first time that the opposition actually, when they elected Capriles to go against Chavez, this was actually the first time that they grouped together and had a combined primary. They grouped together and chose one leader to represent the entire opposition. Do you think that, obviously there's not going to be another election until 2018, but obviously there's not going to be an election until 2018, but do you think that this is something that is going to be going forward, that you're going to see the opposition group together to kind of try and wean Chavez from power?
Yeah, the opposition actually is going to try to stick together for the municipal and gubernatorial elections, which are coming up in a couple of months. There's, I think November, December, and January. I can't remember the exact dates of the elections, but they're coming up very soon. The opposition is united to run in those elections, and clearly it was a good move to unite, and that's the only way they're going to be able to. On the other hand, many of the parties within this united opposition are from the old system that has been discredited, and there's not much love for it in the voting population. So it's better for them to unite and to use the electoral system in their campaign against Chavez, rather than doing the non-electoral route, which they tried in 2002 and 2003. And they did really well, actually, in the parliamentary elections in 2010, and they're likely to do well in the local elections coming up.
And just to kind of get an idea of exactly what kind of Venezuelan is voting for each, could you give us a pretty basic and standard demographic of what a Capriles voter is, who they are, like where they stand within economic terms, what the issues that they're looking to what their big issues are, and then the same thing for Chavez, because I think that within all the reports that are coming out, there's a lot of kind of everything is pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum. So you have people who are very passionate about Chavez, and people who are very passionate about Capriles, and that most of the time is not always the case. So kind of what's the middle ground? Who are the kind of regular people who support each candidate, and what are they looking for in change, and what are the topics that they're looking for?
Okay, let me talk about the stereotypical voters first. I was just in New Orleans this past weekend, where the Venezuelans who live in the southeast of the United States had to go to New Orleans to vote in their consulate there. And so these are the stereotypical Capriles voters. And in fact, 99% of those who voted in the United States and the U.S. consulate in New Orleans voted for Capriles. Right, so there's no middle ground here. 99%, and many of them were staying in the same hotel as I was. I was there visiting a friend, and what was hilarious is that they really do evince the stereotypical upper class Venezuelan voter. They've got their iPads, their Louis Vuitton bags, their Prada shoes, and they've got their Capriles hats and their Venezuelan flags. And they're well dressed and they have good, nice makeup, and they look nice, and they're also quite lighter skinned than the average Venezuelan. So that's the stereotypical Capriles voter, right? And it was just obvious. We walked in the hotel, you had big busloads of Venezuelan voters coming from Miami, and they'd come up, and as the buses would arrive to the hotel, people would start clapping for them, and there was a big campaign to bring them. There was an organization called Aido Votar, air voting. So there was some Capriles campaign activists who rented airplanes to fly Venezuelans from Miami to New Orleans. The consulate in Miami was closed, right? The U.S. government kicked out the Venezuelan consul in Miami, and Chavez responded to that by closing the Venezuelan consulate in Miami. So that's why they had to vote in New Orleans. But so that's the stereotypical Capriles voter. The stereotypical Chavez voter is poor and working in the informal sector and darker skinned and of fewer means, living in less organized neighborhoods and things like that. But the truth is that there are those poles and the opposites on the spectrum, but there's also a pretty large middle class in Venezuela, and they go in either direction, and so you even have some poor neighborhoods where the voting has started to move a little bit more towards the opposition. So a lot of what happens in Venezuelan elections is that it depends on turnout, and in this election, turnout was very high, and you had Chavez winning. In the parliamentary elections a couple years ago, the turnout wasn't as high, and the opposition voters were more energized, and they went out and voted more. But the middle classes in Venezuela really do split pretty, if not evenly, but fairly evenly. There was an article in the Latin American Research Review a few years ago by Noam Lupo, which shows that there's not a monotonic correlation between class and voting. But it also shows that the lower classes really do vote for Chavez more, and the super upper classes really do vote for the opposition more.
So with that, Capriles in his campaigning kind of tried to reach out to the poor, saying he was acknowledging that some of Chavez's initiatives have worked in bettering their situation, like the various misiones, and he said that he would not change that should he be elected president. Do you see that as any hope for any kind of bipartisanship in Venezuela, or is that just not achievable?
Bipartisanship in Venezuela would be very hard to achieve. I think it was a smart move on Capriles' part, because the missions are fairly popular, and it's hard to win against a candidate who's promising more for the poor by promising less. So he had to go out and say, yes, these are good programs, and I will continue them, and I'll make them better. And I think if he had done something else, he wouldn't have won as much support as he did. But I don't think this is an indication that the Venezuelan opposition is going to now start supporting these programs in Parliament. I could be wrong about that, but I don't foresee that happening.
You also mentioned that parliamentary elections are coming up. How has turnout been in those types of elections? I know here in the U.S., there's a lot of people who vote for president, but then when it comes to their local government, it's not paid attention to as much. So do you see that trend being the same in Venezuela?
Definitely. Yeah. Overall, the participation rates are, 10, 20, even 30 percentage points lower than they are in national presidential election campaigns.
And kind of taking this, are we done with the questions?
Okay. Right. Capriles is now going to be running for his former seat as governor of Miranda State, and he'll be running against former Vice President Nicolas Elias Juanin. How do you say his last name?
Hawa.
Nicolas Elias Hawa. Obviously, the former vice president will have a lot of support from Chavez and his backers. Do you see Capriles having a problem winning re-election?
I think Capriles has been a pretty popular governor. He did not carry Miranda State in the presidential elections. He lost it by a very small margin. But I think turnout is going to fall in these gubernatorial races, and I think it'll be a close race. But my guess would be that Capriles will win because he has been popular, and now he has much more exposure. And Hawa has not been an especially popular vice president. I think that Capriles will probably win that.
And now looking to Chavez's re-election in terms of broader implications for Latin America. Just last Thursday, Argentinian Foreign Minister Hector Timerman and Brazilian Foreign Minister Antonio Patriota met to discuss, among other things, how Venezuela might be incorporated into Mercosur. What does Chavez's re-election mean for this and other forms of Latin American integration?
I think it means that they will continue on at an accelerated pace like they have in the past decade. He's been one of the people pushing for this most, with the creation of UNASUR, the Bank of the South, or Banco del Sur, the new organization, I'm forgetting its name right now, CELARG, this new organization of all states in the Western Hemisphere except for the United States and Canada, which just started last year. I think this will continue, and if he had not been reelected, it probably wouldn't have continued at the same pace. These institutions have started to take on a life of their own. The UNASUR especially. Mercosur has been in place for a long time, but has not been especially effective, and that there's been a lot of fighting between Brazil and Argentina, some complaints from Uruguay. And so Venezuela has just been let in, and Paraguay has been kicked out, but it's unclear how that's going to play out. And Chavez has started talking about how he wants Bolivia and Ecuador to come into Mercosur as well. So I think there have been some second thoughts on the parts of Brazilians and Argentines about this change.
Okay. On the other hand, Chavez also recently announced that Venezuela would suspend the Human Rights Treaty of the Organization of American States, or OAS. What may be the reasons behind this decision, and what is your view of this suspension, and will it affect integration efforts?
It may affect integration efforts within the OAS, but there have been a lot of cases where Latin American governments have complained about this organization, especially Brazil right now is complaining about the organization's critique of the Belo Monte Dam that the Brazilian government wants to go ahead with. All of these governments don't want their sovereignty impinged upon by international bodies, and sometimes that's a positive thing, and many times it's not. In this case, I think in Venezuela, it's a wrong move on Chavez's part.
Do you think that with this, there's a lot of fear within the greater international community and also Latin America that this is going to make it harder for human rights to prosecute Venezuela human rights abuses? Do you think that that the removal of this declaration and the subsequent Venezuela has to be is held accountable by the organization? Do you think that will have a severe and obvious impact on human rights within Venezuela, or do you think that it's not going to really change much?
I don't think it'll change much. I mean, the human rights abuses are much worse in many other countries in the region, and who are all signatories to this. I mean, just last week there was a massacre in Guatemala of indigenous protesters. There are many human rights abuses in Latin America that are much worse than anything you see in Venezuela, and that continue unabated. So I don't think signing this treaty or withdrawing from this treaty will have a big impact.
Okay, now speaking of more bilateral relations, Capriles actually met with the president of Colombia, who didn't endorse him, but it implied a little more of a willingness to work with him, and Chavez and he have also had their problems in the past. Do you see problems developing between Venezuela and Colombia now that Chavez is reelected to president?
No. In fact, the new Colombian president, Juan Manuel Santos, has reestablished the relationship with Venezuela and his relationship with Chavez, now that he's no longer defense minister as he was at one point in Colombia. Now that relationship is fairly harmonious. Chavez and the Venezuelan government has been invited to take part in the peace negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC. I don't think in the immediate, Venezuela and Colombia have a long history of having relationships that develop and then fall apart, and a lot of tensions over a long period. But so I can't say what's going to happen in the next 6 years, but in the immediate future, I don't see them having too much conflict, because when there was real conflict between Colombia and Venezuela and trade declined, it hurt both countries' economies, and perhaps especially Colombia's. So I don't think that there's real interest in developing this conflict further.
And do you see Capriles, do you think he's done on the national stage, or do you think he's going to come back in some form or another? Do you think he's going to reemerge on the national stage, or do you think that he'll kind of step back into the state government level, and then a predecessor of the opposition will kind of rise to take his place?
I think it probably depends on how he does as governor of Miranda. I mean, first he has to win. I think he will, but it's not. There's no guarantee. And then I think it depends on what happens in Venezuela in the next 6 years. It's a long time to predict out into the future. But he was a popular figure among the opposition. He did unite them well. The one thing about him is that he does come from this elite family. He has a background in the opposition parties from a long time ago, and so it would probably be good for the opposition to have an entirely fresh face to campaign against Chavez. On the other hand, Chavez may die within the next 6 years. There may be early elections. If there are early elections, before 2018, Capriles is a ready-made candidate and would probably be the opposition's choice.
And talking on that 6 years out, it's a long time away, but and you really can't predict the future. But Chavez does have cancer. If something does happen drastic where he's not able to assume the duties of the presidency? What happens? Does the vice president take over? Will elections immediately start to be organized? What happens? I mean, Chavez does have cancer, and it is a legitimate concern now that he may not live as long as he'd like to. What do you see? Not only what would happen in reality if something were to happen to him, but also what do you think would happen within politics within Venezuela? Would there be this power vacuum that would kind of appear? Would the military kind of step in? What do you see happening if that happens?
Legally, if the president dies within the first few years of his mandate, there will be new elections. The vice president would step in temporarily, but there would be new elections. The vice president is not on the ticket usually.
Right.
So I think that there would be a real crisis within the Chavez camp, or within the government supporters, the PSUV, which is Chavez's party, because there's a lot of divisions within it. There's the divisions between those who are more from the military wing. There's some that are more that are closer to Cuba. There are some that are closer that are more centrist, and so there would be a real fight within Chavismo about who would succeed Chavez as the standard bearer for the party, and the party could well split apart at that point. I don't know that the military would necessarily play a huge role at this point or not. It's hard. It's really hard to predict.
No,
So Chavez actually dismissed his former vice president and now has appointed former foreign minister Nicolas Maduro. Is this seen as kind of him selecting a successor, or since he may or may not accede into the role of president, how do you see that move?
Maduro is known to be more towards a more moderate figure within the Chavista coalition. So it's hard to say. He does look a little bit more presidential than Hawa did, and seems to have more the potential for more popular support than Hawa did. So it could be grooming a presidential successor. But Chavez has never left a vice president in place for very long. So again, making predictions about Venezuela is difficult. And in this case, my guess is that there will be if Chavez does stay healthy, there will be a new vice president within a couple of years.
And since he was the former foreign minister, can this be seen as sort of an effort to reach out to other countries in terms of integration, since Maduro might have those connections?
That's a good supposition. I don't really have any idea about that, but I mean, it would be good because we still don't have ambassador exchange between Venezuela and the United States. Still, I think it would be good to reestablish those more solid relationships.
So with Brazil, with all these kind of these newfound players in the international community going, where do you see the continent heading? I mean, it's a very broad thing to do, but do you see it kind of going further? I mean, further to the left? Do you see it kind of staying on course?
I do think that that Latin American countries have started to more and more since the 2000s have started to unite and integrate a little bit more and to plot their own courses a little bit more. And this is another indicator that will continue. On the other hand, every country's elections, every country's government are their own, and they respond to national conditions. So, a couple of years ago, the new president, there was a campaign, a presidential campaign in Peru. The left was supporting Ollanta Humala. Everyone was worried that he was going to, in the mainstream, people were worried that he was going to turn the country back to the populist left, and it was going to be another disaster. But he's actually campaigned more as a he's actually governed more as a centrist or even a rightist, and he's faced a lot of opposition from the left within the country, and indigenous protests, especially against gold mining and copper mining. And so each individual country is responding to its own constraints and concerns, and it's hard to really say that the whole region is moving in the same direction. And as you pointed out, South America seems to be moving a little bit more towards the left, where Central America and Mexico remains firmly within NAFTA and CAFTA and more allied with the United States, although there are pieces of Central America that are sort of going both ways at once, Nicaragua and to some degree El Salvador as well.
And where do you see, I guess, and this is a very broad thing, where do you see South America, not only Latin America in 10 years? Do you see it better off? I mean, obviously they're going to be trying to be better off, but not only in economic terms, where do you see it in 10 years?
Well, in the past decade, there's a good part of the decade where there's a big economic boom, right? Based mostly on the higher prices for commodities with the rise of China and India. I'm really loath to predict the future, but I would imagine that in the next decade, if China and other countries outside of, well, especially if Europe and the United States can retake a path of growth, and China as well, then I would think that Latin America will do well in economic terms. And if that's true, then politically they'll probably be doing okay as well. The real big issues in Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America as well are, I mean, the big sort of crises have to do with drug trafficking and crime. Crime rates are really high throughout the region. And the other thing is the environment, which is being, because of this commodity-based model, the environment is being exploited at ever faster rates. So there will be a reckoning at some point, or they'll have to change the model to try to look at ways of developing that don't destroy the environment as much.
Looking to the world stage, Chavez has always had a contentious relationship with the United States, and then recently Venezuela's ambassador to the UN said that there needed to be a refoundation of the United Nations with a legal equality of states. Brazil is also calling for more equality on the world stage for the countries of South America. Will Chavez's reelection help them gain this goal?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah. In terms of looking to the world stage, Chavez has always had kind of a contentious relationship with the United States and has wanted more for South America and his country. Brazil is also a country who is increasing calls for equality on the world stage for the countries of South America. Will Chavez's reelection help the countries of Latin America gain this goal?
That's a tough question because, on the one hand, Chavez has tried to gain a bigger voice on the world stage, but on the other hand, he's not very popular anywhere else in the world or in Latin America other than in Venezuela, where he has reasonable approval ratings of over 50%. But in the rest of Latin America, Chavez is not very popular. And Lula has been very popular. Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, is very popular in Brazil. Outside of Brazil, I'm not as sure. But in terms of the world stage, there's sort of the more conciliatory Brazilian approach to getting greater power in the IMF and the United Nations and the Security Council, and then there's the Venezuelan style of being more aggressive about it. It's probably good for Brazil that Chavez was reelected, because then they have someone to play off of as a foil. You can have this kind of outspoken, radical, peripheral third world approach, or you can have our more conciliatory approach. So it's probably good for Dilma Rousseff and the Brazilian government that this other option, the more radical option, that's more scary, exists.
And finally, anything else that you want to add that you think we didn't touch on, that you want to clarify, that you want to maybe that hasn't gotten out there, that hasn't been said much, anything you want to kind of wrap up with?
My only wrap-up point would be that it's high time that the United States stops viewing Latin American elections as referenda on U.S. policy in the region, and it's high time that the United States government reestablish relationships with all the governments in the region and traded ambassadors and returned to more normal relationships.